because when you support good things through government programs, there's always an unintended consequence. And the unintended consequence is always the family gets weaker. And this is why, to me, it's not primarily a political question. This really is theological. Whose responsibility, whose jurisdiction is it to make sure that people are provided for? Whose vision will decide what is important in your life in terms of education or in terms of what needs to be funded? Is that primarily a political question, and therefore the government should be as large as possible in order to provide as many programs to do all the good things that we want? Or do we want to create a society in which people are given a lot of freedom and that families then can be maximally strong and independent from the government? And in order for them to be able to champion their own values, because what subtly happens is when, of course, the government could just decide to engineer society and say, well, we're going to tune up this program and tune down that program. That's, it's very clear when it says we're going to make sure that we provide a lot of funding for contraception. That is a value decision. That's not primarily a decision about, that's sort of political. It's a theological decision. It's saying we want a society in which people can exist for 5 to 10 years as single people, having sex outside of marriage in a way that doesn't allow for there to be pregnancy. Well, there's a cascade of unintended consequences that are so devastating to a society when you do that. But of course, those things have been decided by the government. And again, these are value questions or theological questions. And so we need to, this is why I think this is really important to look at these things through that lens. And the constant refrain that is sort of like, are these things valuable? Are they important ideas? Like, is it important to care for older people? Like there's when we decided to say older people will get Social Security and Medicare, there has been over the last 50, 60, 70 years a complete cultural transformation. And most people don't ever recognize the cascade of implications that this created. But this caused the baby boomer generation, the first generation, to grow up where they knew their parents didn't really need them to be provided for. Well, it completely changed the way that they treated their parents. They didn't need to care for their parents, and so they were it designed a certain system. And it also really, it's crazy. One of the things it allows you to do, and this is very subtle, but it's obvious, that if you're a parent growing up and you're raising young children and you're tempted to just abuse and neglect your children, if you lived in a society in which you always looked at your child and said, "Oh, they're the ones who are going to provide for me in your old age," that provides an enormous incentive to raise your children properly, to create a reciprocal relationship with your child and say, "I'm going to love you, provide for you during your lifetime because I know I'm going to someday going to need you to love and provide for me and for your mother or your father." And so that kind of reciprocal relationship existed. That has been completely shattered. And we'll never know how many children endure neglect and abuse because of that. But we do know that it did create a society in which generations feel maximally independent from each other. And you might say, well, isn't Social Security, Medicare a good thing? Well, we'll never know because we'll never be able to run the counterfactual on that and see, okay, how much suffering did it create when the unintended consequence of destroying the connection between generations, destroying the reciprocal relationship that existed between generations for thousands of years, when we destroyed that through government programs, we'll never know what actually occurred. Because the assumption is, well, we can't have older people who are dying of preventable causes. So we're going to need to protect them and provide for them. And so, yes, I mean, there's an immediate good. I think a safety net of last resort could be a really useful thing in society. But once it becomes an entitlement that everybody does, it re-engineers all of society and changes the whole way that the generations have been interacting with each other for thousands of years. Is that a good thing? Well, it's all being hidden. And so what you see in this life of Julia is we need to do that through every single season of everyone's life. We need to re-engineer every season. The time you're 3 years old, you're 5 years old, you're 15 years old, you're 20 years old. And every single season, a government program will sweep in and re-engineer society so that you do not have to rely on your family. You have to rely on the government. And it's obvious why the government wants this. It's obvious that why it gives enormous power to the government. And that then allows all the money to flow up there, and the amount of corruption and things that are inevitable are going to happen. But that's not even close to the worst byproduct of this kind of thinking. The worst byproduct of this kind of thinking, I think, comes when it obliterates the family, because you've essentially re-engineered society in which in order to get to an equality, nobody needs the family. And so if you need the family, then it's really important to need the family if you want to have a society of strong families. But that then you always run the risk that people are going to suffer who have who've decided to neglect their families. And again, this doesn't mean that there won't necessarily be safety nets for when horrible tragedies befall certain families. I think those are best really created within faith communities. But if the government wants to step in there, there's an argument for that. This is not what you saw in the life of Julia was not the government sweeping in extraordinary circumstances to help somebody who just went through something that is very unusual. This is the government wanting to be involved in every single decision, every transition to engineer a particular outcome and to provide for this single person.